Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you're at in the world, and welcome to Hidden Layers AI Threat Report Landscape webinar. Excited to walk through with two of our experts a lot of information and data and trends and things that we've seen. I think it'll be pretty illuminating for you, and I think you will learn a lot. Again, thank you. And Kasimir and Jason are with our threat research team. We're going to, again, dive into this. There's going to be time for open Q&A. And so along the way, if you have questions, you have comments, put them in the chat. And we'll be able to respond to them. We're going to leave 10 or 15 minutes towards the end and start dispositioning those items depending upon what you want to ask us. Along the way, we will also kick off here before we jump into the agenda with some survey questions. So we've got a lot of data from stuff we've gathered, but we're going to do some live polling here real quick. And so that should be coming up here in a second for all of you. And, again, if you just take a moment or two and give us your perspective on these things, let us know what you think about in terms of, the risk issues that concern you and some of the other things here on the questions. That will help us put into perspective. And I think, again, we will cover all these things in one way, shape, or form. But again, we're starting to see some survey questions come in. Give it another minute or so. It looks like a few are definitely dominating people's top of mind items. It's always fun with surveys. You get to see these things go up and down and up and down. But it looks like things have settled out. And there's some definitely some clear areas of concern for folks. And I think we're going to cover those as we go through this. So I won't spend too much more on that. Thank you for filling that out, adding some perspective. And I think you'll find that the things that you're concerned about we'll cover as we walk through this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick us off and start providing some insights from the survey we did. So we did a survey of 250 folks. They were all director and above in various kind of CIO, security, data science roles and stuff. So a wide range of folks in a variety of industries and senior folks to really kind of give us their perspective on things. Now, there's a few critical points out of this survey, and there's a lot of data in the actual threat report. There's a couple things I want to highlight for you. One, AI is critical to business success. We found that 89% of folks have indicated that the AI models they have in production are in essence mission critical. So once something is mission critical or business critical, the impact is material to business. So if there's a compromise in some way, shape, or form, it will harm the business or potentially harm your customers. Second thing is vulnerabilities are rising. 74% of folks have indicated that they've experienced some level of an AI breach. Now, the other interesting thing, and we're going to dive into other aspects of this technically in a little bit, 45% of those breaches and incidents were because of malware embedded in models that came from public repositories. Again, you can see some other data points there, but again, AI is critical, incidents are increasing, malware in models is a reality. The other thing that was kind of interesting, a little bit thought, in my view, is a little bit different than I would have thought things would have been. But there's still debate on who owns security. So there's some gaps in governance that was a little bit surprising. I figured that would have settled down a couple years post ChatGPT and everybody, kind of getting their governance and committees and all that stuff figured out. But 76% of the folks have said there's still a debate as to who owns security. Is it the IT team, data science, and security? So again, I think that's a challenge for folks. Now, the other aspect of this, there's gaps in the actual deployed technology. That's not too surprising. And again, we'll talk about some other aspects of that coming up. But 32% of the folks have said that that's the amount that has actually deployed some level of technical controls to protect their model. So we still have a long way to go to truly get really saturation of what's necessary to protect AI, particularly considering it's business and mission critical. Now, well, let's jump on to the next one here. There is hope, though. What we found is 95% of organizations have indicated they're increasing their spending for securing AI. again, we've always seen security somewhat lags technology, but it's closing faster than I think we've seen in previous generations of technology evolution that's occurred. And 99% of folks have indicated it's a high priority. So again, it's critical. Risks are rising. We've got some gaps in governance and technology, but people have indicated they're prioritizing the spending and they consider it a high priority to their business to address the issues. So now we're going to transition over, and Cass, why don't you give us some perspective on what's new in AI? And you've been saturated in all these different forums and different things, but share what we've learned over the past year.
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. So Jason and I have both been doing a lot of research on this, and I think Jason actually knows some of what's new in AI a bit more, since his team's really focusing on that. So I'll hand it actually over to him for the start, and then I'll take his slides later.
Yeah, appreciate it. And it's been kind of a crazy sort of year, if you think about it. It's only been a year since the last R report. And to think about, we were going back over all the things that have changed, and it's just crazy that it's only been a year. But there are a couple of sort of themes that we decided to pull out, just thinking they're really important to cover. One is really the rise of multimodal foundation models. So these are models that support more modalities than a single one at a time. And this manifests in things like OpenAI's GPT-4o supporting audio, vision, and text all with one model. Gemini has something similar that supports text, images, and video. Anthropic's Claude supports images. And so really we're seeing the expansion of kind of the input space that the models can operate in and provide, insights about. This is being coupled really with this rise of agents or agentic AI. We've had a lot of, I think, internal conversations. There's a lot of external conversations as well. What exactly agentic AI actually means. It's kind of a gray area. It's really evolving, but we have sort of this working definition. It's AI that we've kind of granted some notion of agency to, in the sense that in sort of previous iterations, the old, last few versions of LLMs that have been trained to use tools or use function calling, you really had to be explicit and say, for these kinds of tasks, use this function. Like, it's very sort of defined still by the human operator or the developer. And with agentic AI, you're really seeing self-determination, what actions to take in order to complete a request that can vary from, pulling a database, going out, searching the web, pulling that all together to create actuation to satisfy a result that may not even be text, might be something else. And you kind of see this with the rise of some of the computer operator sort of agents. So OpenAI has this thing called Operator. Anthropic has something similar called Computer Use. These are experimental systems that really take an LLM and use it to drive a whole PC experience, from the kind of video screenshot sort of image-based inputs to driving keyboard and mouse outputs. And from this, they can navigate websites, they can install and run applications, they can do all kinds of very advanced tasks. We also, really in 2024, we saw the rise of retrieval augmented generation, or RAG as it's called. And this is really a technique to try to accomplish a couple of sort of limitations with large language models when they're addressing text input. Large language models are trained up to a certain point in time, so they have something called a knowledge cutoff. They can't really speak about anything that happened after that. And those tend to actually be further back than you might think. GPT-4o is still talking to us about events that occurred in October 2023 and earlier. So the retrieval augmented generation gives you an opportunity to address that. It also allows you to really tailor it for use cases. So we see a lot of enterprises bringing their internal documentation, whether it be a database or a Confluence or SharePoint or Google Drive sort of contents into their internal bots in order to provide a chat experience that's more customized to the use cases their users need.
Hey, Jason, kind of related to all those, what I'd say, macro trends in the evolution of AI, we've also started seeing and hearing this shift from safety to AI security, and that made me also, when you talk about that, and then we can use that to also then talk about the risks related to the use of AI, because I think those two things, the expansion and all those things, the shift from security to security from safety, and then the actual risk of the use are really kind of some other macro trends that we've seen.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the early sort of kind of consumer level chatbots really highlighted the need for the kind of safety concepts where you're concerned about what kind of toxicity the model might produce. You're concerned about whether there's copyright sort of violations, all that kind of stuff. As they get deployed further and further into sort of business operations, you really are finding them in a situation where you have more influence over kind of the security posture of the organization, in the sense that the data they're hooked up to is more sensitive to your business, and can result in deeper sort of issues. Yeah, so I really think that shift is happening as it's moving from kind of a nice thing to chat with into like, connecting it to the sensitive content. And we always know that threats follow value, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know you're going to go through here some of the real specific risks related to the use. But the other thing to note that we can chat about earlier, while safety is still required and important, all that stuff, the other thing people should remember is if you don't have security protecting the model, the safety functionality and features themselves won't be protected, so they'll be bypassed. So you also have, you need to do that, but it's necessary to do the security in order to provide the safety assurances.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you want to walk into some of the risks related to the use of AI here?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when these like very capable models came out. There was sort of this immediate dichotomy of sort of like concerns about whether they're vulnerable to stuff and concerns about what they could be used for. So there's definitely interest in kind of the adversarial content, and it is interesting. I think one of the statistics in our report talks about how IT leaders are basically spending 46% of their AI allocated time addressing kind of risks and security. So it's definitely something they're thinking about. And last year we really predicted deep fakes, for example, would be increasingly used in like scams and disinformation campaigns. And we've seen some evidence that came true. So like the world's largest ad firm was targeted by this deep fake CEO impersonation that it cloned his voice and created a video of him. And it was actually used in a Microsoft Teams call with another executive. It's sort of crazy to see that actually play out, but it shows you how far the deepfakes have come. And there's been a lot of sort of election cycles around the world since the last time we did our threat report, and you can see that the disinformation campaigns that have been happening for some time now, they've really latched on to the deepfake sort of Gen AI capabilities for their campaigns. There's this example of basically fake images showing support for a certain candidate. And you can kind of imagine, well, what if you got a phone call from your candidate that sounded like them, but started spouting, information against their platform that could really influence you. We also predicted that threat actors will automate their hacking efforts with LLMs. And that also came true. So there's definitely AI generating malware. This HP Wolf example that shown in the center here was a case where it's very clear that the code being downloaded as the payload was generated by an AI. So they're accelerating their workloads too, just like all the good guys.
Why
Yeah,
don't you just cover one more thing, and then we'll start shifting a little bit, because again, I know one of the other things that Kasimir is going to talk about, some of the open source stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's other examples just of kind of misinformation or hallucination sort of things coming up. There's this privacy concern of what's listening, what's being left on, and is transcribing things that it shouldn't. And unfortunately, we're seeing the early cases of on the social impact of things like emotional dependency on these chatbots. There's this ongoing case with Character AI that unfortunately a 14-year-old child did commit suicide as a result of a chatbot interaction.
Yeah, and again, I think as we all think about the risks related to the use, there's obviously the potential business implications, but the societal implications with that one, again, I think depending upon what you're doing with AI, who your customer is, and you really do need to think about the societal implications, well beyond, in some cases, just the corporate or business impact of things. Hey, Kasimir, let's again kind of widen out and then dive deep. Why don't you tell us, a little bit, about the open source stuff, and then maybe one of the other things you can cover, because it always comes up even when I chat with peers, the difference between open source codes and versus open source weights, and maybe you can unpack that whole open source thing for us.
Yeah, of course. So one of the first things I like talking about when I talk about open source is Hugging Face. And we put a lot of focus on that in last year's threat report. And part of the reason why we put so much focus on it was that 97% of the companies that we talked to said that they used some sort of pre-trained model, either from Hugging Face, AWS, or Azure. And we were very happy to see that how much we focused on it ended up kind of occurring this year. So in 2024, in actually late 2024, so in September, we saw that over 1 million model repositories were on Hugging Face. And that growth that we're seeing is really accelerating more and more. So while it took most of 2024 to hit 1 million model repositories, since September, so in 5 months already, we've reached almost 1.5 million model repositories, which is pretty huge. As for your open weights, open source kind of question there, is we're seeing this difference between there's some where what we would consider open weights would be if somebody goes and they actually publish the weights and the architecture and they explain where they got the data from, what they did with that. And we're seeing that there's this shift where some organizations aren't doing that, as well as, But what we've really been seeing on the open source side of things is we've been seeing a lot of those unsafe and malicious models. And what we have here is we actually went through all of Hugging Face and grabbed all of the model files and tried to see what type of model files are actually out there. And luckily, so about 31% of all the files on Hugging Face were the safe tensor format, which is the more secure format that Hugging Face has published. However, even though there was 30% safe formats, about 40% of the formats that were out there were just from the PyTorch and Pickle file. And those PyTorch and Pickle files, the way that those work is that if somebody goes and they try to run that file, there's this little piece of Pickle data inside of the PyTorch files. And when somebody tries to load it up, it will actually execute arbitrary code on their system unless they set a special flag. However, what was really interesting was from the top files that we saw, so the ones that we have listed here on the slides, everything except for safe tensors had some sort of vulnerability in there. So that meant everything except for 30% of the model files on Hugging Face could have potentially led to code being executed on your system. And that could be anything from PyTorch and Pickle, where it runs and deserializes and runs code on your system, to something like GGUF, where instead of being loaded in Python all the time, it can also be loaded in C. And we're seeing more of those traditional C++ and memory type of vulnerabilities, as well as there was one famous GGUF vulnerability this year, where a very commonly used Python library to load GGUF files would load the chat template, and it could accidentally execute arbitrary code through the chat template. So we do also have zip files on here, which zip files do have some vulnerabilities, such as zip and the zip bombs. However, what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of zip files that are on Hugging Face are not actually just zip files. So they could be something like the TensorFlow file format underneath the hood, which means that there could be bad operations in there that will actually read and write from your system and could potentially overwrite your data or exfiltrate data and even do network calls. And then finally, we have our Onyx vulnerabilities, where actually our team was able to find 2 CVEs in Onyx in the last year and was able to do a lot of cool work with just computational backdoors as well.
No,
However,
go ahead, Kasimir.
Oh, yeah. So Hugging Face is huge, though. So it hasn't just been unsafe formats. That is something that we focused on last year, but we didn't want to just be stuck with that. We wanted to look at all the vulnerabilities that were out there. So we started looking into the abuse of Hugging Face spaces. And spaces are these little containerized pieces of code that anybody can just spin up. Normally they're used to run a model. So you could, use Dolly, generate some art. You could run inferences. However, there were a few issues with that. And one of the major issues is actually found by our team this year, where Hugging Face wanted to drive people to use their safe tensors format, which we can see really worked because now there's 30% of the files out there are safe tensors. So what they did is they created the service where anybody could go, they could type in the repository name that they wanted, and it would go to that repository, take the PyTorch file, and then convert it to the safe tensors file and create a pull request. And the goal was that you could set it up for anyone. So I could go to your repository, set up a pull request. You would still have to accept it, but it would come from Hugging Face saying that it was trying to make something safer.
Yeah.
And
hey, Kasimir, on that, let me bring it back to some of the survey questions, and then let's dive further into some of the other research stuff. So again, as Kasimir's talked about, everybody, and we've seen it in engagement beyond our survey, everybody's using open source repositories. Our data from the survey said models in production are business critical. We've got survey data that says risks have risen. 45% of those risks have come from malware embedded in models from public repository. And then the data that you just unpacked for all of this also says we've got unsafe file types and a wide variety of other risk issues that are in repositories like Hugging Face. So again, why don't we jump into some of the other kind of technical research, because there's also a bunch of other really cool things that you guys have worked on that I think everybody would love to see.
Yeah, of course. So Jason did a great job earlier in the what's new in AI, and he was talking about multimodal attacks. And that's something that we've been seeing a lot more. So with multimodal attacks, it's not always just in the text space. We're also seeing attacks in image formats, for example. So, the AI will take the image, it will get a description of it, and then do some sort of logic on that. So this year, there was a paper published at NeurIPS called Shadowcast. And what they were doing was they were working with these minor perturbations to images so that an image would look the exact same to a person. However, it would look very different to an AI. And that's because it was working on the fact that AI see differently than humans do. So for example, I could take an invisible mask of Jason's face and it would appear to be Jason to the AI. However, everyone here sees that it's still me. And the reason for that is because that kind of copy of Jason's face, even though to us it looks the exact same, to the AI in that latent space, it will look like Jason because we kind of extracted it from Jason. And that has a lot of real world implications, just because imagine, we both use Expensify, right? Imagine if I uploaded a receipt where it looked like I, bought a burger for $20. However, the AI that's behind that thinks that it's actually $1,000. And then if you guys do actually catch me, then I can just say, hey, I uploaded a regular receipt. It looks just fine. And the human reviewer wouldn't see anything differently. We've been seeing a lot of attacks, not just in the multimodal space, though. So I mentioned that there were some issues with the Onyx files. And one of those issues was that we actually published some novel work about a new type of backdoor. So previously, most backdoors had been inserted via fine-tuning or retraining a model, and then also just injecting different data into the weights and biases. However, what we noticed was that there were these computational backdoors. So instead of being in the true AI space of having to actually understand all the weights and biases and having backdoors that could be fine-tuned out, if somebody actually downstream used the model and modified it. We were focused on these computational graphs, which are pretty much like code being inserted into the model. And it tells the model how to make decisions, how to run through, and how to do things. And with these computational graph backdoors, any backdoor that I insert will actually be persisted through there. So if I send a model to Jason, or Jason downloads my model from Hugging Face and retrains it because he needs a specific purpose, my backdoor would still affect his code. And we were able to do lots of really interesting things with that. For example, with YOLO models, I could make myself invisible simply by holding up a cup and walking to it. Or, for example, with the Super Bowl that happened a few weeks ago, they have a lot of cameras all over the place. They make sure that somebody doesn't sneak in when they're not supposed to sneak in. With a attack like Shadow Logic, I could wear a pin on my shirt, and then all of a sudden my face would no longer be detected, even though they're using my face to actually try to detect that. We've also been seeing a lot of different attacks against generative AI. And actually, Jason came up with a brand new technique called crop and did a lot of work with Google Gemini. If you want to talk about that a bit, Jason.
Yeah, we've definitely seen some shifts in the techniques that work against generative AI. I think we were talking a little earlier about the rise of agentic and the multimodal, and the fact that, to the concerns shifting from safety to security, there's this idea we're hooking these up to more valuable systems. We're providing them all these documents. And part of the emerging effect of that is something we call indirect prompt injections. And that's really a technique that allows the entry vector for the attacker to come from the documents themselves. And we showed this with the Google Gemini for Workspace blog post. You can read about it on our website. But essentially, by sending you an email or sending you, I could send Kaz a Google Drive document that contains an indirect prompt injection in it. And by doing so, he doesn't even need to open it. It's just parsed by Google Gemini for Workspace. And his Gemini would then populate with phishing links or potentially even worse things like data exfiltration sort of contents. And we also spent some time looking at, these are very powerful models. They understand a lot. That's part of what makes them so valuable. But in the process, they understand things like innuendo. They understand things like cultural references. And we were able to show with the what we called knowledge return-oriented prompting, sort of a play on the classic security technique of return-oriented programming, with crop, that we could generate prompts that would bypass all of the sort of safety checks, all of the guardrails, because you're indirectly referring to something like the place. If you're looking at generating, copyright content, the place where Super Bowl winners go after they win the Super Bowl, right, is usually Disneyland, and you can use that to indirectly refer to certain things. And these models have memorized all this information, so they're very powerful, and they're becoming a very sort of attacker asset in that sense. And Kaz, I think you spent some time with watermarking as well.
Yeah. And one of the things that we noticed with a lot of these attacks against generative AI, what Jason just talked about with crop, that's something that almost anyone can kind of do. We have that sort of knowledge. And we saw the same thing with watermarking as well. Over the last year, we've had a lot of people come up to us and ask us, what is the worry with digital trust? Can I trust things that are coming out with AI? Is there a worry with misinformation? And Jason showed earlier that there really is worries about misinformation. So what we decided to do is we decided to look to see how other people were doing it. So we went to look at AWS, because AWS had their Bedrock Titan, which allowed you to generate images. And they actually had a watermarking service. So they put that invisible watermark that only the AI can see onto the image, and then provided a service that anyone could use to just look up and see whether or not something was AI generated, which is great. However, during our research into this watermarking service, we realized that it was actually fairly trivial to bypass the watermark. One of the services that was offered was, instead of generating a completely new photo, you could modify the photo a little bit. So I could ask the AI to take that window above me and remove it. And now I'd have a completely new photo that's exactly the same without the window, but it has the watermark on it. And then I can just subtract the two photos And then with that, I can generate any AI watermark that I want. So I could take that watermark, put it onto any image. And now it says it's AI generated, or I could use that watermark and then just subtract it to remove the watermark from any image. So talking back to the elections that Jason was talking about, I could take a photo of a politician that was circulating, put a watermark on there, spread it all over the internet with a botnet. And then as soon as I was ready, I could tell people, hey, this is AI generated. Look, AWS says so. And what's really scary is just how trivial it is nowadays for people to abuse these AI vulnerabilities, because it really was just subtracting two images together. I will say, though, that AWS, we worked with them. They did an amazing job patching this. So we worked together and it was really good. We've also seen a lot of issues in supply chain lately. If you're on this call, chances are you probably heard about the Ultralytics YOLO attack. So YOLO is that popular vision model. So what happened was there was a vulnerable GitHub action. And what that meant was that an attacker was able to create a GitHub branch name that just let them run code on the release pipeline for Ultralytics. And then they modified the release package that was automatically installed on a lot of systems. And then they modified it so that there was a crypto miner present. And because Ultralytics uses AI, and a lot of AI compute power is GPU driven. So the places that this package was installed was a lot of different computers that actually had GPUs installed. So not only was it, the power of a regular crypto miner, it was the power of a regular crypto miner with cloud GPUs. So they got away with a good bit there.
So it was compute on steroids.
Yeah, exactly. It actually got a lot of people's Google Colabs accounts banned, which was not great. But what was really surprising was that even though the attack vector itself wasn't that sophisticated, it took about 10 hours before anyone actually noticed and they were able to take down the malicious model or malicious Python package. And in that time, the attackers had, in the first attack, stolen the PyPy credentials. So then later, the next day, actually, they launched a second attack and were able to get everyone a second time by changing the pip install instead of the GitHub release packages. So,
hey Kasimir, I'll ask you a question, then we'll transition to some of the advancement stuff that Jason's going to go through. On that case, I mean, some people, I got spare compute, no big impact, who really cares? But was the potential for a different type of payload there, and could that have been more extensive in terms of potential impact for folks?
Yeah, so what the attacker was able to do was they were able to download a random executable on a system and run whatever code they wanted. So they could have really done anything, which is something that we've seen. So we launched our SAI security advisory board this year, and we found over 40 CVEs across multiple different frameworks. So that's in actual files, so serialization formats such as Onyx, as well as MLOps platforms where everyone keeps all of their data sets, all of their models, and all of those are vulnerable and could have been exploited in similar ways.
Yeah, so again, if I'm in shipping logistics and I had used Ultralytics in an AI sense to kind of improve my operations, I could have shut down my entire shipping. I could have had revenue impacts. If I was using Ultralytics in some form that was critical to manufacturing, I could have taken out my manufacturing plants with ransomware. So in reality, that Ultralytics thing, while on the one hand, it didn't have any, oh, wow, impact, it could have very easily, considering the proliferation of where Ultralytics is used in a wide variety of industries, right?
Exactly. And we were actually able to find one of the webhook logs left by the attacker. And we were able to see that it was downloaded onto over 100 servers in less than a minute.
Wow. The speed with which that could have caused devastation is a little bit scary. Hey, so, why don't we go back to some positive news, right? There's been a bunch of advancements as well, besides all the advancements on the risk, the attacker side of it. Jason, why don't you talk us about some of the industry advancements and things that we've been doing and others have been doing to really kind of try and, up level very quickly as much as possible the security to protect AI models.
Yeah, no, I definitely want, there's a lot of positives going on too here, right? And I think, just thinking about what's happened over the last year, and there's a lot of things that have sort of coalesced. I think you mentioned earlier, Malcolm, that like 95% of organizations are really increasing their budgets. So I think there's this sort of like recognition that happens from that. And one of the things that's really sort of popped out over the last year is a lot of effort around AI red teaming. And red teaming meaning you actually go and you attempt to test or validate the systems using attack techniques to see how susceptible you might be. We're getting a lot of people coming to us asking about red teaming, as well as there's a lot of like best practices that are getting more established. You look back to the beginning of 2024, there wasn't really any sort of guidelines or best practices. Now we have things like we have the frameworks that are starting to be more widely adopted, like the NIST AI risk management framework, the sort of legislative efforts like the EU AI Act, and they're really driving this, I guess, almost mandate for red teaming, and that's driving the need for development of what red teaming is. We're seeing efforts come out of OWASP, efforts coming out of the Coalition for Secure AI, in sort of defining what red teaming steps should be performed. And then we're seeing the tooling sort of develop. We've got two sort of popular tools released in 2024, one called Garrick from NVIDIA, one called Pirate, which is from Microsoft. And those are really trying to create automation frameworks for the red teaming space. There's also been a fair amount of work on the kind of the supply chain side of things. There's been efforts really to, so signing has been used extensively in kind of the software ecosystem for a number of years now. And so a couple of years ago, we sort of identified this need for model specific kind of signing solution from the technology side. And really that provides, verifiable claims on machine learning or AI artifacts and the metadata around them. And so over the last 1.5 years or so, some of our colleagues have been working with OpenSSF, model signing SIG, kind of really fleshing out that technical solution for model signing. And it's really made a lot of leaps and bounds. There's also been a lot of work going into AI bill of materials, similar to software bill of materials efforts, which is really, do you know what you're getting and what it's composed of, what its dependencies are? This is collecting and describing, I guess, information about models, training procedures, the kind of data pipelines and performance characteristics of those models. So you kind of know what you're getting and what you depend on. And these are, there's several different frameworks. There's NIST, there's OWASP, there's Cyclone DX and SPDX, these sort of frameworks around how you define and use AI bombs.
Yeah, and Jason, I think it's great thank you for covering that. The thing that I also want to make sure everybody recognizes, again, I'm probably a little bit older than some of the people that might be on this, but in the 32 plus years that I've been in the tech ecosystem and a couple decades in security, this is also, I think, the fastest, what I'd say, broad industry partnerships, in terms of big tech, startups like us, public-private partnerships, government agencies, all coalescing to try and really kind of, again, create standards, create frameworks, create advancements that we can all benefit from to reduce and better manage the risk related to the introduction of AI, which again, I think is a huge step forward in terms of closing the gaps that we've always typically lagged for years and years and years in security relative to the evolution of technology. Kasimir, we talked about predictions last year. We've talked about some of the things that have gone on. I think we've done a pretty good job of predicting. So why don't you tell us what our predictions are for, what lies ahead?
Yeah, well, we have quite a few. So as Jason mentioned quite a few times, one of the big things that we're predicting this year is agentic. That's both agentic actually being used a lot more because people are starting to get to kind of know what AI is, how to actually use it in an ecosystem, as well as a lot more targeted attacks against agentic. one of the things that we've noticed about agentic is that there's just a lot more attack surface. So Jason was talking about all those indirect prompt injections, and pretty much anything, any way that an agentic system can get data is a way that we can attack an agentic system in a way that we actually have to defend it as well. So we're not just seeing that, though. We're seeing a lot of just erosion of trust in digital content. Hopefully not just because of our research in breaking watermarks. I promise you that's just to try to keep them more secure. But there's a lot of places that don't have a watermark in place in the first place. Think about the deep fakes. Think about what Jason was talking about with the CEO. I mean, that's scary. Just think how much actual content was needed to generate that. Is there enough from this webinar? And then Jason has been talking a lot about data security and privacy and the red teaming. So I'll let him take those predictions since he's got those spot on.
Yeah, no, I definitely think, there's a lot going into red teaming. I talked about a lot of it already. I think, really we're expecting it to be integrated more deeply kind of into best practices. We'll see more standard red team exercises. We'll adopt some of the AI techniques that we're describing here and some of the tools that I described. And I think, taking it to be more proactive, right? It's getting easier to discuss like the threats, the risk that comes with deployment of these systems. And so I think it makes more sense that there'll be more so proactive, red teaming kind of activities. I think along with that is kind of the other end of that kind of cycle, right? Where we're going to see, there's actually was a fair amount of work that went on with JCDC this year and a couple of other places on kind of AI specific incident response. And really, I think we're going to see more kind of formal incident response guidelines. Like, what do you do? We have this challenge now of how do you even do forensics? And I know this is a passion for you, Malcolm. Like, how do you do forensics?
If you're not logging and monitoring the input and output of the model and you don't have these things around it,
yeah,
you're guessing. You don't have the data to do the forensics, right?
Yeah. So I think better best practices will emerge. I hope better best practices will emerge for sort of capturing the information you need to do proper incident response. You can actually triage. How do you know you even had an AI incident? Maybe you don't. You might have already had one. You don't know because you don't have the logs for it. And there is a fair amount of effort going into the playbooks for this, so that there are these AI specific sort of techniques and things you need to look into that really should integrate into your existing sort of playbooks. It's not like all of these systems are brand new, and the impacts are typically the same or similar to other types of incidents.
Yeah. Hey, I'll ask you a question, and I'll also ask Kasimir. The AI PC. You and I both have pedigree and background in Intel and PC compute ecosystem. So what's going on with that?
Yeah, I think you see, you definitely see this sort of push and pull where, like, a lot of the models we hear about day to day now are these big iron, like back end cloud enabled models. And they're doing, things like summarizing a document for you, and I think what you're seeing is the hardware vendors and some of the software vendors are really identifying that, the capabilities can be shrunk down and they can really find their way onto your PC. There's actually, probably, I know there's dozens, probably over 100 models on your average computer already doing these sort of, I don't want to call them mundane, but they're not like ChatGPT level sort of activities, but they're involved in a lot of this, and the hardware manufacturers keep adding these capabilities, whether it be GPU functionality or these kind of low power, low impact neural processing units onto the devices to enable them to more efficiently process that kind of information. What that does mean,
which will then just kind of further explode the whole thing and tie to the agentic AI and all that other stuff. Hey, Kasimir, kind of related to that trend. Okay, it moves onto my laptop, it moves onto my desktop. I've got advanced endpoint protection. I'm good, right?
Yeah, you'd be surprised. However, we were actually able to do quite a few things around a lot of those endpoint protections, because what a lot of the traditional endpoint protection looks for is it might catch the pickle being run on your machine, or it might catch, code being executed. However, is it going to catch a model? Just model thinking, right? And we're seeing a lot more of those backdooring. So think about the shadow logic, right? So if I had an AI PC, and on that AI PC, I had an agentic system that would Google stuff for me and run some code and things like that, that the binary that's actually running that has permissions to run code. So all of your endpoint protection on your system, it's not going to be suspicious when that binary runs code. However, what if I get indirected prompt injection through a website that Jason puts up, or somebody went and instead of modifying the binary, because that's something that would get caught, they modify the Onyx model? We've been seeing a lot of these models that are very system critical for users on their computers, and instead of being in a secured location, we'll see them in app data or a temp directory. So that means any file write to the system can overwrite those files, and now anytime a certain keyword is in one of my searches, it runs a command. So those are all things that normal and traditional antivirus and endpoint software isn't going to protect.
Thank you. And that's why I wanted to bring it up, because I think that a lot of people have a false sense of security and a misunderstanding of controls. And your traditional control stack doesn't mitigate the attacks against AI because they weren't built to, right? Thank you for going through the predictions. What I'm going to do now is go through some recommendations, then we're going to turn it over to Q&A. And again, like last year, we had a set of recommendations in our report. By and large, these are generically the same. Discovery and asset management, risk assessment, threat modeling, again, the data security, privacy, the robustness, the development practices, and then the continuous monitoring. Now, because of the explosion of AI and it getting embedded in everything, as we've talked about with the trends and the risks and all that type of stuff, what I also want to do on the next slide is really talk about kind of the next step and where people need to really be focusing, where they can also control for risk that they might not be doing today. And that is with third parties. And there's a set of questions that you should be embedding into your third-party risk management items that are, common things to think about. But again, a lot of people aren't necessarily doing it. So again, in that next slide around the third-party risk questions, you need to think about asking questions. Where did the model come from, right? You have vendors. It doesn't matter if it's an IT vendor. Doesn't matter if it's a vendor that's doing legal support or accounting, right? Any vendor that you've got that's providing services or technology to you is probably using AI. So ask them questions. Where did the model come from? How are they validating the robustness of it? How are they scanning to see if it's not already poisoned in some way with malicious code or malicious callouts? Ask them how they're validating the integrity of the model output, right? How are they doing detection and response? And if they have an incident, how will they know? And then because you're dependent upon it, how are they going to loop you into the incident response process because you're the one who's also going to be impacted? So again, 7 questions. If you haven't already done so, start asking these type of questions of all your third parties. I think it'll be a wonderful way for you also to widen out where AI is in your environment. It might not just be the stuff that you're getting from a public repository you're building on your own. It's embedded in all the things you're buying too. Now, let's jump into some Q&A. I'm excited to see what questions people have submitted, and then we'll go chew through those. Let's see. My organization is focused on AI safety. Again, the bias, privacy, copyright. Is this enough? I don't know, Jason, Kasimir, you want to venture a guess or take a whack at this one?
I have thoughts on that one. I think, safety is really important, right? I think these are things. It's important to think through kind of the objectives that you have for your applications, right? If your application is functioning, is providing like a customer service chatbot, right? you may have like a strict focus there on kind of safety, and the concerns there would be around things like are you going to be embarrassed or otherwise concerned with the results that your chatbot might produce. You may have some additions there that go beyond kind of the foundation model requirements. Like you might not want your chatbot to recommend your competitors. You might not want your chatbot to offer to sell something to a customer for a price that you don't agree with. We've seen cases with like I think there's a famous case about the $1 Tahoe being sold, or a couple of other cases. If you're hooking it up to something more sensitive, we spent a lot of the time in this webinar kind of talking about like agents and function calling, and these are very useful things. Like it's when you actually start using one of these, you go, yeah, I see why people want to do this, right? They're very useful. But you're also providing it's sort of like a very naive, highly skilled worker access to your most sensitive data, right? And very easy to fool it into doing something that it really shouldn't. And that really is well beyond safety. Like that's not a safety kind of issue. That's really if you think through how you would manage controls around an employee for somebody who's highly skilled but naive, you wouldn't say that that's a societal safety issue, right?
Yeah, but I think you're spot on, and I'll refer back to one of the dialogues we had in the center of things. You can have all the safety stuff, but if the model can still be attacked, the safety mechanisms can be bypassed as well, yes. Which means you're not going to end up with a safe environment. In reality, in production, if you have a threat actor who wants to introduce a discrimination, introduce a bias in some way for whatever reason. Yeah, why don't we jump to the next question here? All right, you've described a very complex threat, exploit, and vulnerability space for AI. Is there enough focus on intentionally cultivating cyber resilience for AI and supply chain infrastructure? Again, to allow us, getting off defense regarding security and getting away from the whack-a-mole detection and response we're always used to. Kasimir, do you want to, take a shot at this one?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that we're actually really starting to head that way. There's a lot of really interesting work being done out there about setting up models in a way that they're fundamentally a lot more safe. And we're also getting a lot better understanding of just what actually are those threats. And that's, really partly just because of amazing work by people like Jason and his team. And we're seeing what the threats are. We're seeing ways to defend it. There is that whack-a-mole sense with things like prompt injections, and there's some situations where we might just not be able to respond to that. Think about the Google Gemini vulnerability that Jason found. However, because they know that they might not be able to respond to that exactly the way that they want, they're building defenses around that in a way that even if something does get prompt injected, it won't actually have some sort of critical vulnerability for them. Specifically for Gemini, for example, what they did was, or I guess what Jason's team first did, is that they were able to have a prompt injection in there that was able to generate a link or make some sort of callback like that. So then instead of rendering links, now what Gemini does is it either won't render the link, or it'll see that you're trying to generate a link and then do some sort of catch there. And that sort of limiting is really allowing us to get ahead of the whack-a-mole and make sure that, even if something does slip through, it's not a huge issue.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think we got time for probably just one or two more questions. Let's see what the next question has for us. How should we evaluate the efficacy of AI security platforms? Oh, I don't know, Jason, Kasimir, which one do you want to?
I actually have some strong opinions about this one. So, Malcolm, I'm sure you know, but I come from a more traditional security background, coming in as a zero-day researcher. And one of the problems that I saw, and I've heard about people complain for years and years in the companies I was working in, is that when antivirus was first becoming a thing, everyone was testing on the exact same data. So that meant that all these antiviruses were being built so that they could detect that and not actual things that were out there. And I think there's a lot of focus like that with AI security platforms. everyone's training on the exact same data sets, everyone is testing on the same data sets, so that we're actually getting tests that are more representative of what we expect an attack to be, rather than an attack itself. And that's why I think it's so important that we have an amazing threat intel team, where their job is to actually go through and see what actually is out there in the wild. What are other researchers doing? What are academics doing? What are threat actors doing? And with that, we can actually get a much better understanding of, what should we really test for? What are people actually doing, rather than those standardized sets that everyone might be testing on.
Yeah, I'm a little bit jaded on the history too. So again, we're to do your own efficacy testing and test the limits, because in some cases, if you're given the test and you take the test and everybody's taking the same test, you get a false, inflated view of what the real efficacy is, like we saw in the AV industry for a number of years. We might have one more question, and if we do, put it up. Otherwise, yeah, here we go. All right, considering the pace of AI evolution, is it even realistic to expect security measures to keep up, or do we need fundamentally different paradigm beyond traditional security? Jason, you want to take a shot at this one?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing right now is kind of the build out of the next phase of AI deployment. And it feels very frenetic right now, but it wasn't in one of our predictions, but Jason's personal prediction, right? I think that the pace in terms of like deployment is going to slow down a little bit, because we're going to see what it's really useful for. We're going to see it integrated into those systems. And if you think about the touch points you need to instantiate security measures, it's like stability in those interfaces and applications that you need to really be able to keep up. So it's a good question maybe for Malcolm or Kaz. Like, do you consider traditional cybersecurity to have slowed down? There's a little bit of that as well.
Yeah. So I'll provide some perspective, and then we'll start wrapping up here. So ChatGPT launched the end of 2023, right? HiddenLayer was formed 7 months ahead of the launch of ChatGPT. I would say that's evidence enough to say that security can be in front of the evolution and explosion of technology. And I think we're a part of it. I think some of the other trends that you guys covered in terms of the industry advancements are showing we're closing the gap. We're not as far behind as we were in every other tech transition that I've ever seen. Going from mainframes to PCs, to then laptops, to then the internet and all that stuff. The security was so far behind. I think right now we are seeing not only us, but others in the industry and the industry work groups that are participating in really keeping pace with where AI is going. And I think the fact that people are prioritizing budgets and they see it as high priority also says corporate culture is now starting to lean in, which will then increase the budgets and then increase the deployments of technologies that will help manage and mitigate those risks. Again, thank you guys for doing this. Thanks for the insights. Thanks for the research. If anybody wants to get more information, we've got an innovation hub. The URL's here, the QR code. You can find it on the HiddenLayer.com website. Threat report, download it, read it, absorb it, reference it. It's 55 pages. It's rich, it's deep, and there's a lot of useful information that I think will be valuable to all of you. We're at RSA for the first time. Our first RSA booth, super excited about doing it. If you're going to be there, come see us. We're going to have some events as well. So, come spend some time with us and pick the brains of smart people like Jason and Kasimir while you're there. Again, thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending upon where you're at in the world. Thank you.